I've been involved in conservation research and implementation for some 40 years now. And throughout that period, I've been thinking about what makes a conservation champion, what defines leadership in the realm of conservation implementation. And I came up with a scheme, which I'm not going to present here, but just in summary, argued that conservation champions were those people with high self-confidence and higher levels of compassion. That is, the ability to act positively on empathy. So what I'm going to do in this brief presentation is just outline a theoretical framework for this intuitively derived scheme for identifying conservation champions. We all know that the context for doing conservation these days in the 21st century are gruesome, to say the least. We have a world that is still intent on economic growth via mass consumerism. We have wars. We're dealing with global change at a massively escalating scale. And what we don't want is to end up with images like this or realities like these paintings, rather dystopic paintings made by Alexis Brockman. What we have to do is find our way out of the mess we're in to avoid the eventuality of this really unsavory and scary world. So in order to come up with some framework for my intuitive scheme for conservation champions, I started delving into the leadership literature probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And this is an overwhelming literature. Publications in the grey literature, in the popular magazines, primary literature, and of course many, many books. There were some reviews. So, for example, a recent one identified 45 leadership styles based on 864 papers. This was not particularly helpful. So, from the reading I've done, and I must stress it's not much at all, I came up with two major streams in terms of leadership style. I don't think this is anything novel. Many, many other authors do the same. So the first one is corporate leadership. This is a self-confident, competitive, personal goal-driven, outcomes-focused, and draws heavily on technical intelligence. Think of corporations, governments, and many other similar such institutions where this kind of leadership is required in order to keep extremely complex systems going. The leadership style has its roots in modernism, starting in the late 1700s and with the Industrial Revolution and the increasing complexity of our lives, in capitalism, and also in neoliberalism, or should I say more recently, since the late 1970s. The other leadership stream, if we can call it that, is compassionate or servant leadership. This is compassionate, collaborative, consensus goal-driven, process-focused, and draws on emotional intelligence. This kind of leadership has its roots in postmodernism, in socialism, and in neo-Marxism. Now, both of these leadership streams are required in an effective conservation initiative. You can see that the first ones I've listed for each of these styles are the ones that certainly struck me as being important traits of a conservation champion. I must also point out, however, that both leadership styles can lead to autocratic leadership. Certainly in a neoliberal world where we ordinary folk are seen largely as consumers, and where wealth accrues to fewer and fewer people, the realm of democracy becomes extremely limited. And the same can be said for neo-Marxism, that where we ordinary people are seen as victims or persecutors, and intervening to correct these perceived problems also leads to authoritarianism. So I let things be for many years, and then a few years ago I started reading the works of Iain McGilchrist. And McGilchrist is a polymath of note. He is comfortable in the humanities, the natural sciences. He knows a lot about the physical sciences. And he's written 2 books recently. He does have others. And the one that really got me was his book, The Master and His Emissary. And in this book, he introduces the divided brain hypothesis. And what this hypothesis predicts is that each hemisphere in the brain represents a completely different worldview. So the right hemisphere sees the world in a completely different way to the left hemisphere. These hemispheric differences are biologically ancient. They go back to Coelentrates about 600 million years ago. As I say, they're 2 different ways of attending to the world. These 2 hemispheres provide these different ways. We use both hemispheres in everything we do. So it's not that the right hemisphere is just used for creativity. The left hemisphere plays a very important role in that, and so on and so forth. And our culture, and this is very disturbing, is becoming increasingly biased to a left hemisphere worldview. And why do I say that's concerning? Well, let's go to the next slide. So here we have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Let's see what the differences are between these 2 hemispheres. So the left hemisphere focuses locally. The right hemisphere focuses globally. So let me explain that using an example, one which McGilchrist himself uses. Imagine you're a little seed-eating bird, and you need to distinguish between little pebbles and seeds. And that's what your left hemisphere does. It classifies what it sees into different categories, and then makes a decision, yes or no. Is that a seed? Isn't it? The right hemisphere, on the other hand, is not concerned so much with what it's eating, but as being eaten. So it's scanning the horizon to see whether any predator is going to come swooping down on. It looks at the context. Its attention is global rather than local. The left hemisphere represents what it sees to the right hemisphere. So in other words, if it sees a seed, that image will be compared with other images of seeds in its memory stack. And if it is whatever it decides, yes or no, it will then represent that information to the right hemisphere. So it's an emissary in a sense. It provides information. Whereas the right hemisphere is present. What it sees is what it processes. The left hemisphere focuses on things. The right hemisphere on relationships. Left on parts, right on the whole. A holistic view. Whereas the left hemisphere would have a reductionistic view. The left hemisphere focuses very much on use. It's utilitarian. Whereas the right hemisphere focuses on beauty. The left hemisphere on knowledge, the right hemisphere on wisdom, competition, collaboration, either or, both and. So the left hemisphere is really a grasping machine world, a kind of algorithmic world, if you would like, whereas the right hemisphere is a careful, connected world. But you need both hemispheres to do anything. So, for example, in music, the left hemisphere deals with the rhythm and the right hemisphere deals with melody and harmony, and so on. So we need both hemispheres, but the master, the right hemisphere, should oversee the emissary, the left hemisphere. So the right hemisphere should be the master, the left hemisphere, the emissary. It's very, very important because it makes you realize that the worldview that you have, or the worldview that a leader has, can have profound impacts on how a particular community will move in terms of their left hemisphere or right hemisphere perspectives. Let's give that a little bit more perspective. And I want you to concentrate on the middle panel here. And here we have a population of humans taken from anywhere in the world. And on the upright axis, we have their frequency, the frequency of people in that population with a strong left hemisphere bias or a strong right hemisphere bias. And what you would expect is a normal distribution, with most people having a fairly balanced perspective in terms of hemisphere biases. Okay, let's say we have a culture and environment that is influenced by a leadership structure where there is a strong bias towards a left hemisphere world outlook. So in other words, these are more authoritarian kind of rulers. We think of people today like Putin or Trump. And what this environment does is, in the population at large, it shifts the perspective towards the left. And this has happened in our history several times, and I'm talking about Western culture here. I'm sure the East has its own incredibly interesting stories that are similar, but the Enlightenment, modernism, and postmodernism were times when there was a strong left hemisphere bias. And, you know, the Enlightenment, in many respects, is regarded as a huge advance for human culture coming out of the Dark Ages. But it was a very left hemisphere perspective. It was an attempt to make precise the complexities of the world, and it denied or sought to deny the deep spirituality that many humans experience. Modernism, the Industrial Revolution, was also a time of left hemisphere bias, and as is postmodernism today with its authoritarian doctrine. And then culture and environment could also shift the frequency towards a right hemisphere bias. And this happened during the Renaissance, a period of great creativity, both in the arts and the sciences, and the Romantic period, stuck as it was between the Enlightenment and the modern period in the 1700s and early 1800s, also a time of great imaginative works. So we know that from history that the culture of a particular grouping of people can be shifted according to the leadership biases with leaders. So left-biased leaders will tend to make a country less tolerant than, for example, right-biased leaders. Just to summarize, pressures are mounting and options are shrinking. It's a difficult path ahead. It's like swimming upstream. And every now and so often, a flood washes you back down the river. But we have to keep on going. We have to find ways of averting the catastrophes that some of us imagine. And that is going to come through good leadership in conservation practice. We know that a left hemisphere bias results in increasing authoritarianism and bureaucracy and decreasing tolerance. And we don't need that in conservation at the moment. In fact, ever. We need a different way of leadership. So conservation leadership, in my opinion, needs right hemisphere dominance over the left hemisphere, beauty and awe above use. And we need to select leaders, appoint leaders who have that ability to bridge the hemispheres in such a way that the right hemisphere worldview remains the one that pervades. Thank you very much.